cryobay alarm had been screaming for 6 seconds before anyone moved. Lieutenant Kara Voss was already dead by the time Commander Dale Ortiz reached her pod. Not dead the way humans died. Not blood and stillness. Dead the way the Lyran died. Her lips blue black, her chest a solid block of frozen tissue, her eyes open and glazed over like winter glass. The medical scanner in Ortiz's hand read 31 degrees below zero, internal body temperature, and the pod had never malfunctioned once in 4 years of deep space deployment. The ship's doctor, Lieutenant Felix Marsh, crouched beside the pod and said nothing for a long time. "She touched her," he finally said. Ortiz looked at him. "What?" "Ambassador Zyla." Marsh stood up and closed the scanner. Kara went in to wake her for the morning briefing. Standard procedure. She must have made contact. Ortiz looked across the cryobay at the other pod, still sealed, the frosted glass showing a shape inside. The Lyran ambassador? Tall, blue-skinned, built like someone had taken a human silhouette and stretched it toward something older and colder. Her species ran at -8 degrees Celsius, body surface. Touching one of them without a thermal suit was like pressing your palm to a block of dry ice for 30 seconds. Except it wasn't just the cold. The Lyran secreted a compound through their skin during stress responses, a compound that dropped surrounding temperature another 40 degrees in under a second. Kara Voss had probably never felt a thing. Ortiz set the scanner down on the pod rail. "Wake her up," he said. "Sir, the ambassador's biology requires—" "I know what it requires. Wake her up anyway." The Lyran ambassador's name was Zyla Enthar, but she had asked the crew to call her Zyla because human mouths could not manage the tonal suffix without sounding like they were gargling. She was the first of her kind to board a human vessel. This diplomatic mission was 3 years in the making. 2 governments, 1 fragile peace, and now 1 dead lieutenant on the floor of a cryobay 60 million miles from the nearest inhabited planet. When the pod opened and Zyla stepped out, she did not look at Kara Voss's body. She looked at Ortiz. "I did not mean for this," she said. Her voice was like wind through copper pipes, harmonic and low. "I know," Ortiz said. "Your crew will want me to answer for it." "My crew will do what I tell them," Ortiz said. "What I need from you is an explanation of what happened, and I need it right now." The rest of the mission briefing was short and brutal. Zyla Enthar had been dreaming, or whatever the Lyran equivalent was, a deep, reactive sleep state. Kara Voss had reached in to manually initiate the wake cycle. Zyla had startled. The compound had discharged. It was not murder. It was biology. It was also a dead woman and a diplomatic catastrophe in equal measure. The ship's crew of 19 said nothing at dinner. They ate looking at their trays. Zyla ate in her quarters, which were kept at -11 and sealed with a thermal barrier that cost the ship 14% of its heating capacity. Ortiz sat alone in the observation deck and watched the stars not move. Private First Class Cole Hadley found him there at 2200 hours. Hadley was 26, from a small town in Ohio, and had been on the mission as part of the diplomatic security detail, which everyone privately agreed was the least necessary posting in the fleet because nothing was supposed to go wrong. He had a habit of showing up in places where the commanding officer was sitting alone, and he had a habit of bringing 2 cups of coffee, and he had never once been told to go away. "You're not going to court-martial her?" Hadley said. It wasn't a question. "She killed a crew member." "She didn't mean to." "That's not how military law works, Hadley. That's not what you're actually thinking about." Ortiz took the coffee. It was too hot and he drank it anyway. The Lyran Council is going to hear about this within the week. They'll want Xyla recalled. If she goes back before the treaty is signed, the whole negotiation collapses. 3 years of work, 8 months in space. And Karavos is still dead either way, Hadley said. Yes. So what does sending Xyla back actually fix? Ortiz didn't answer. Hadley sat down on the bench beside him and looked at the stars too. He had the kind of face that didn't ask for anything, which was why Ortiz kept not telling him to leave. What do you know about Lyran biology? Ortiz asked. More than I did this morning, Hadley said. I've been reading the mission files. The compound she secretes. It's a defense mechanism, triggered by physical contact from an unknown source during sleep. It's not voluntary. It's like asking someone why they flinched. Marsh said the same thing. Marsh is right. Hadley turned the coffee cup in his hands. There's something else in the files. Something the diplomatic team flagged but didn't escalate. Ortiz looked at him. The Lyran have a word, Hadley said. Lyran soul. It doesn't translate cleanly. Best approximation is something like the one who does not freeze. In their history, there are records of specific individuals who made contact with Lyran without triggering the discharge. Not immune, exactly. More like compatible. Harmonically stable, their biology says. The Lyran consider it significant. Culturally significant. How significant? Hadley set down the coffee. The last human who appeared in Lyran historical record was 400 years ago. They called him something that translates roughly as the warm anchor. He negotiated an end to a Lyran civil war that had lasted 2 centuries. They built a monument to him on their home planet. A statue. They still leave offerings at it. Ortiz was quiet for a moment. You're telling me this because, he started. Because Xyla asked to speak to you privately, Hadley said. And because she specifically asked that you bring me. The cold came off Xyla's quarters like a living thing, pressing against the thermal barrier the way deep water pressed against a porthole. Ortiz and Hadley stood in the corridor outside the sealed door, and the temperature readout above the frame said -11 and dropping slightly, which Marsh had said was what happened when a Lyran was emotionally elevated. Xyla opened the door from inside. She was wearing the ship-issue thermal liner they had modified for her dimensions. And she looked at Hadley with the Lyran expression that the mission files described as recognition with weight, which the diplomatic team had translated, perhaps generously, as reverence. You felt nothing, she said to Hadley. Not a question. Hadley looked at Ortiz. Ortiz gave him nothing back. Felt nothing when? Hadley said. In the corridor this morning, Xyla said. When you steadied me after I left the pod, your hand on my arm, you felt nothing. Hadley was quiet for a moment. Then, I felt cold. Cold is what humans feel when they touch any cold surface, Xyla said. They do not feel the compound. They do not freeze. Cold is irrelevant. She tilted her head, a Lyran gesture the files said meant recalibration. You are the first of your kind in 400 years. The corridor was very quiet. Outside the ship, 60 million miles of nothing pressed in from every direction. Ortiz said, What does that mean for the treaty? Xyla looked at him. It means everything, she said. Or it means nothing. That depends entirely on what your private does next. The medical bay was the warmest room on the ship, which under current circumstances felt like a kind of insult. Felix Marsh had the mission files spread across 3 screens and a physical printout that he had covered in annotations because he was the kind of man who did not trust himself to remember things he hadn't written down. Dale Ortiz stood at the doorway. Cole Hadley sat on the examination table and looked at his own hands, like they had recently made a decision without asking him first. "Walk me through it again," Ortiz said. Marsh pulled up the Lyran Biological Index, page 47, the section on the cryo-discharge compound. The compound is technically called Thar-Vel in Lyran. Their word for it translates literally as cold recognition. It's not venom. It's not a weapon. It's a biological authentication system. When a Lyran is in a vulnerable state, deep sleep, injury, high emotional distress, and an unrecognized entity makes physical contact, the compound fires. It drops ambient temperature around the point of contact by 40 to 60 degrees in under a second. For most species, that means frostbite. For smaller organisms, cardiac arrest. For a human making unprotected skin contact at close range, it means what happened to Caravas. And for Cole, Ortiz said. Marsh tapped his stylus against the desk. For Hadley, apparently, it means nothing, which should not be possible. The compound doesn't discriminate by species. It fires based on body heat signature and contact pressure. Hadley's hand is warm. Hadley touched her arm. The compound should have fired. But it didn't, Hadley said. But it didn't, Marsh agreed. Which means either there's something wrong with my understanding of the biology, or there's something about Hadley's physiology that the compound reads as unthreatening. Compatible. He pulled up a second screen. The Lyran diplomatic files have a section on Lyran Sol, the warm ones. Their historical records describe roughly 30 documented cases over 2,000 years of recorded Lyran history. The warm ones don't trigger the discharge. The Lyran have various cultural explanations for this, none of which are scientific. But there are two biological theories in the Xenomed literature. What are they? Ortiz asked. Theory 1, and genetic. Certain humans carry a specific microbiome on their skin surface that produces a faint chemical signal the compound reads as Lyran adjacent. Like a password. The compound recognizes the signal and stands down. Marsh clicked to a new page. Theory 2, electromagnetic. Human bioelectricity runs at a frequency range that, in most people, creates interference with the compound's thermal trigger. But in rare individuals, the frequency is low enough or irregular enough that it doesn't register as a threat stimulus at all. The compound fires at what it can detect. If it can't detect you properly, it doesn't fire. Hadley looked up from his hands. So I'm either the right smell or the wrong frequency. That's a reductive summary, but yes. Can you test it? Ortiz asked. Minar, I can run a bioelectric scan and a skin microbiome panel on Hadley right now. It won't tell me which theory is correct, but it'll tell me if either of them applies. Marsh was already reaching for the scanner. What I cannot tell you is whether this is stable. If it's the microbiome theory, stress, illness, change in diet, all of those can shift the balance. If it's the electromagnetic theory, fatigue and sleep deprivation change the body's electrical output. Hadley is compatible right now. That doesn't mean he'll be compatible in 6 hours. Then we move fast, Ortiz said. Hadley let Marsh run the scanner over him without asking what fast meant. He had a reasonable guess, and he didn't love it. The results came back in 12 minutes. Marsh stared at them for a moment, with the expression of a man encountering something he had expected, but had not fully prepared himself to see. Both, he said. Ortiz crossed the room. What? Both theories apply. His skin microbiome profile matches the chemical signature flagged in Theory 1. And his resting bioelectrical frequency is in a range that the Lyran literature specifically documents as non-threatening. He's not just compatible, Commander. He's maximally compatible. If the historical cases were graded on a scale, Hadley would be near the top. The room was very quiet. Hadley looked at the scanner readout without fully understanding what he was looking at, which he suspected was how most historically significant moments felt from the inside. "So, what does this actually mean for us?" he asked. "Practically, right now, for the treaty." Marsh looked at Ortiz. Ortiz looked at the wall for a moment. "Zyla needs to complete the mission," Ortiz said. "She's the authorized ambassador. Without her signature, the treaty framework collapses. But after what happened to Kara, every member of this crew who isn't in a thermal suit is at risk if they get within arm's reach of her. The diplomatic protocols require face-to-face engagement, physical presence in the same room. Lyran don't sign documents. They don't use screens for final agreements. They use personal witness, which means someone needs to stand in that room with her and be the human face of this ship. And that someone can't be you," Hadley said. "I'm the commanding officer. If something went wrong, the mission loses its command structure. It should be Marsh. He's the most qualified." "I have a heart condition," Marsh said flatly. "The cold alone would be a problem." Hadley looked between them. "You already decided this before you came to talk to me." "I decided nothing," Ortiz said. "I'm asking you." Hadley thought about Kara Voss. He had known her for 8 months. She had been quiet and efficient, and had never once asked for anything complicated from anyone. She was dead now because biology didn't negotiate, because a reflex had more power than intention. He thought about a statue on a planet he would never see, with offerings left at its feet 4 centuries after the man who had stood there was dust. "What would I actually be doing?" he asked. "Accompanying Zyla for all direct diplomatic interactions," Ortiz said. "Standing in proximity, providing what the Lyran protocol calls witness presence. You would not be negotiating. You would not be speaking on behalf of the human alliance. You would be there." "I'd be a comfort object," Hadley said. "You'd be a bridge," Ortiz said. "There's a difference." Hadley thought about it for exactly 9 seconds, which was how long it took him to realize he had already made up his mind and was just waiting to stop arguing with himself about it. "All right," he said. "But I want to talk to her first, just us, before any official protocol." Ortiz raised an eyebrow. "If I'm going to be her bridge," Hadley said, "I'd like to know what she's actually building toward." Zyla's quarters were cold enough that Hadley's breath fogged the moment he stepped through the thermal barrier, and then the moisture from the air collected on his eyelashes in tiny crystals that didn't hurt but made everything slightly sparkling, which was a strange aesthetic for a difficult conversation. Zyla was standing at the viewport. The stars beyond it were very still. "You have questions?" she said without turning. "A few?" Hadley said. "Starting with, did you know? When I touched your arm this morning, did you know right then what I was?" She turned. Her face was built along different geometry than a human face, longer in the jaw, wider at the temples, with bioluminescent lines along her cheekbones that brightened when she was focused. Right now, they were bright. "I knew something," she said. I did not know the word for it until I looked at you and remembered the old stories." "The warm anchor." "Yes." "The Lyran built him a monument," Hadley said. "We did." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. The bioluminescent lines pulsed once. "Because he did not flinch," she said. "Our species carries a long history of being feared for what we are. Other species learn what we are and they step back. They keep distance. They make rules and protocols and thermal suits." She turned back to the viewport. "He did not. He stood close. He stayed close. He treated our nature as a fact rather than a threat. You cannot know what that meant to us, what it still means. Hadley stood there in the cold with crystals on his eyelashes and thought about what Marsh had said. The right smell, the wrong frequency, even random biology that had nothing to do with courage or intention or character. I should tell you, he said. It might just be chemistry. What I have, it might not be anything meaningful. Zyla looked at him. The warm anchor said the same thing, she said. We built him a monument anyway. The treaty room was whatever they could convert in 48 hours, which turned out to be the ship's main conference space, with the temperature dropped to -6 and every crew member who didn't absolutely need to be present rotated out. Marsh stood outside with a cardiac monitor and a thermal emergency kit. Ortiz stood at the back of the room in a full thermal suit and tried not to look like a man waiting for something to go wrong. Hadley stood next to Zyla at the table. No suit, no thermal liner. Just his standard uniform and the particular frequency of his own electrical field, which he could not feel and could not control, and had apparently been waiting 4 centuries to matter. The Lyran diplomatic confirmation was not a signature. It was a spoken affirmation, recorded on both species' equipment, witnessed by a qualified individual of each party. The Lyran qualification was specific. The witness had to be physically present within arm's reach of the ambassador. The witness had to be known to the ambassador by name and by direct contact. The witness had to remain present for the full duration of the recitation, which took 11 minutes. 11 minutes standing next to a being whose skin surface ran at -8 degrees, whose stress response could freeze a human solid in under a second, who had killed someone 4 days ago without meaning to. Hadley stood there and breathed fog and listened to Zyla speak in her own language, the copper wind harmonics filling the room, and he did not flinch. Not because he was brave, particularly. Not because he had decided anything dramatic. Mostly because she was nervous. He could tell from the way her bioluminescent lines pulsed in an irregular pattern, and he had spent enough time around people who were nervous to know that the most useful thing you could do was simply stay. When the affirmation ended, there was a silence that lasted longer than silences usually did. Ortiz said, from the back of the room, "That's on record?" "On record," the communications officer confirmed. The treaty framework was complete. Not signed, not stamped, but witnessed, now which was what the Lyran required. And apparently what the Lyran required was enough for the human diplomatic office too, because Ortiz had made sure of that before anyone walked into this room. Zyla turned to Hadley. Her bioluminescent lines were settling, the pulse stabilizing, the irregular rhythm smoothing out. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. Which was, he understood, approximately the least adequate response to the situation. But it was the honest one. Marsh appeared in the doorway, took one look at Hadley's face, and held up 2 fingers in a question. Hadley gave him a thumbs up. Marsh exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for 11 minutes, which he probably had. Ortiz pulled off the thermal suit's helmet and walked to the center of the room, where he looked at the recording equipment. He looked at Zyla. He looked at Hadley. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Zyla said, "the Lyran Council receives the record within 6 days. They will confirm the witness. They will ask about the Lyran's soul. They will want to know his name." "And then?" Ortiz asked. "And then they will want him to come to our world," she said. "Not as a soldier, not as a diplomat, as himself." She looked at Hadley again. "They will want to see the warm anchor with their own eyes." They have been waiting a long time. Hadley stood in the cold room that smelled like frost and something almost floral, which he had learned was how Lyran emotional relief registered in the air around them. And he thought about Ohio, about the town he had grown up in, like where nothing extraordinary had ever happened to anyone as far as he could tell, where the most remarkable thing he had ever done before joining the fleet was win a county fair pie-eating contest at 16, which he now found contextually hilarious. "When would that be?" he asked. "That," Zyla said, "depends on how quickly your commanding officer can spare you." Ortiz looked at Hadley with something in his face that was not quite a smile, but was close enough to count. "Take all the time you need," Ortiz said. The Lyran homeworld had no official name in human language, because Lyran did not name their planet the way humans named things. They called it the place that holds us, which was a phrase and not a name, which the human diplomatic office had spent years arguing about and eventually just labeled as Lyran Prime on all the official documents, which the Lyran found charming in the way that a parent finds a child's drawing charming. Cole Hadley arrived in the 3rd month after the treaty confirmation, on a Lyran shuttle that ran at a temperature he needed a light thermal layer to survive, but did not need a suit, which was progress. Zyla and Thar met him at the landing platform with 3 members of the Lyran Cultural Council and the kind of formal stillness that meant something very large was happening, and everyone involved was trying to hold it carefully. The monument was not where he expected it. He had imagined something central, public, a plaza or a grand hall. Instead, they took him to a place outside the capital city, a hillside that sloped toward a valley filled with a fog so cold it sat on the ground like a living thing. And at the top of the hill, there was a figure carved from a stone that was black and slightly translucent, like frozen night. The figure was human in shape, standing with its hands open at its sides, facing outward toward the valley. It looked nothing like Hadley. Different build, different posture. 4 centuries of artistic interpretation had done what 4 centuries usually did. But the hands were right. Open, facing down and outward. Not reaching, not braced, just open. Hadley stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. One of the council members, an elder Lyran named Velen Sor, came to stand beside him. Velen Sor was older than any human had ever been, and she moved like someone who had learned to carry enormous time without being crushed by it. "Do you understand what we built this for?" she asked. "Zyla told me," Hadley said, "because he didn't flinch. Because he did not treat our nature as a condition to be managed," Velen Sor said. "There is a difference. Your people have managed us very well for decades. Schedules and thermal suits and careful distance. All of it sensible, none of it wrong. But managing something and being present with it are not the same." Hadley thought about Marsh outside the treaty room with his cardiac monitor, which had been sensible and not wrong. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Not rudely, genuinely. Velen Sor looked at the monument. "The same thing we wanted from him," she said. "To be an example of what is possible. Not a hero, not a symbol, an example. Humans look at us and calculate the danger. We understand this. We have done damage, as you know, as your ship knows." She paused. "But your kind also sent a young man from a place called Ohio without armor, and he stayed." "I didn't know about the history when I stayed," Hadley said. "I just thought she was nervous." Velen Sor made a sound that the translation device in Hadley's ear rendered as the Lyran equivalent of laughter, which was lower and more resonant than human laughter and felt like it came from somewhere older. "That," she said, "is exactly why we built it." The formal proceedings lasted 4 days. Hadley stood in rooms that were very cold and said very little, and mostly just remained present, which was what they wanted from him. Zyla was beside him for most of it, which helped. Boss, because she had the particular gift of knowing when he needed the Lyran equivalent of a briefing and when he just needed someone to stand with him in a room. On the last day, Velen Sor gave him a small piece of the same black translucent stone the monument was carved from, no larger than his thumb. Lyran tradition, she said. To the warm ones, a piece of the place that holds us. He carried it in his pocket on the shuttle back. Zyla sat across from him on the flight. The cold of the shuttle was fading as they rose out of the Lyran atmosphere, and the heating systems compensated, and she was watching him with the bioluminescent lines at a steady, calm pulse. "Will you come back?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's not entirely my decision. But if it were..." He looked out the viewport at the Lyran homeworld receding below them, the cold fog in the valleys visible from orbit, white and still, the hillside where the monument stood just a dark point on the curve of the landscape. "Yeah," he said. "I'd come back." Zyla looked at the viewport too. The Lyran Council had filed a formal request with the Human Diplomatic Office that morning, Hadley knew, though he hadn't read the full document yet. It requested that Private First Class Cole Hadley of the Human Alliance Fleet be designated as a standing diplomatic liaison to the Lyran Home Council, with full cultural witness status, pending his voluntary agreement and his commanding officer's release. Morsad, it was the most official piece of paper that had ever been about a county fair pie-eating contest winner from Ohio. He had not agreed yet. He was still deciding. But the stone in his pocket was warm from his body heat, which seemed, in a way he couldn't fully articulate, like a kind of answer. The shuttle broke atmosphere, and the stars came back. And Cole Hadley sat in the cold and thought about open hands and the long patience of people who had simply been waiting for someone not to flinch. Somewhere below him, the monument faced the valley. The offerings at its feet were fresh,